Okay, so we are almost at the end of the quarter. So the final exam is actually 2 weeks from today. It's on Wednesday of finals week, and it's at 1 o'clock. So it's 1 to 3. So if you need to make arrangements to take it at the testing center, you want to let me know. Also, I wanted to point out that there's an assignment available to you, which is the extra credit assignment. So I mentioned this in lab as it was part of the lab notebook guidelines. So this will be particularly helpful if you have missed a lab, but even those people who have come to all of the labs and have gotten full credit on their lab notebook, you can do this as well. And so it is actually worth a total of 20 points, but that actually depends upon whether or not you kind of meet the requirements. So if you meet all the requirements, then you get the full 20 points, which would include picking a topic over something that we talked about this term. So if you wanted to talk about hormones in plants, that would probably not be appropriate because we haven't talked about plants this quarter. Okay? So it wants to be something over something that we talked about in terms of animals, and it should probably go beyond what we just talked about in lecture. So I've had people just rewrite their lecture notes for me, and that did not get full points. And so, for example, we talked a little bit about Alzheimer's, but if you wanted to do a more comprehensive, just a little bit of research, you could write up a summary, and then you would also include your references. And so here it says that you can do research on a topic covered this term that goes beyond what was discussed in class. You can then write a 1 to 2 page summary on the information, and you must include references, and your text will be checked for plagiarism. So you're going to upload any text that goes along with your project into Canvas, and Turn It In will tell me whether or not it has been submitted previously by another student, or whether or not you just copied and pasted from a website, for example. So there are some other examples of projects that you can do. And so I kind of included some things that if you're a theater major, if you're a music major, I've had people that have done pieces of art for me that relates to something that we talked about in biology. But if you are going to create a piece of artwork, you must also include a written summary that describes the biological concept. So you can't just give me an abstract piece of art and say, this is my project, and then I have to kind of just interpret it. So I want you to interpret it and put it into the context, okay? So if there's anything else, I've actually had people write pieces of music and songs and then record it for me. And I've actually also had people do video productions, like, what did they do it on? They did it on capillary exchange. So they did a little video showing capillary exchange, kind of stop motion kind of thing. So this is actually due June 10th. So at midnight. And so if you have any questions about this, let me know. That's the extra credit assignment.
Like, we discussed autoimmune diseases, so if like there's an autoimmune disease, would that fit under that?
We haven't talked much about the immune system, but yes, so as long as it's not talking too much about the genetics, because we did talk about genetics, but if you wanted to talk about how an autoimmune disease affects the different systems in the body, so like lupus affects all the systems. So yes, so autoimmune diseases would work because we did touch a little bit on the immune system when we were talking about the circulatory system and the white blood cells. Yeah. Anybody else have any other questions about that? Okay, so this can be found on the home Canvas page, right at the beginning, and the recorded lectures are down below. And we just had I didn't actually put the third homework assignment, so we just had 3 homework assignments this term. Okay, any questions before we start? Okay, so remember that your last quiz number 7, will be on Monday. And so it will be over the information from last Wednesday as well as today. And we're going to talk about the nervous system a little bit, and then we're going to talk about the sensory system, including smell and taste and hearing and vision. And then the last lab, which is next Monday, we're going to be talking about the structure of the eye. And so you're going to turn in your lab notebooks to me next week. So you want to make sure that you have everything completed. And so I'll give you till Wednesday to turn it in. So you could turn it in right after Monday's lab, or you could turn it in to me on Wednesday. So next Wednesday, you need to have your lab notebooks completed. And then I'll grade those and give them back to you before you take the midterm exam on. I'll actually probably have them outside my office if you wanted to come pick them up early. Okay, otherwise, you can get them when you come in for your final exam. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about neurotransmitters because the homeostatic balance of neurotransmitters is extremely important. So remember we talked about homeostasis and how generally there's a negative feedback mechanism that helps to maintain a relatively constant level in your or steady state in your body. And that applies to the amount of neurotransmitters that are released into the synapses of your brain and your other parts of your nervous system. So these are released by neurons into a synapse. They are generally short-acting, compared to hormones, which also help to regulate homeostasis and communicate between organs. But hormones are released by endocrine glands into the circulatory system. Some neurotransmitters can actually be a hormone as well as a neurotransmitter, and we'll talk about an example of that. So kind of one of the most best examples of a neurotransmitter is called acetylcholine. And this is an excitatory neurotransmitter, and it is, released by motor neurons. So this causes skeletal muscle to contract. So a motor neuron is a neuron that innervates skeletal muscles. And so you saw an example of this when you did your tissues in lab. And so in that synapse, acetylcholine is produced, and it actually causes a depolarization of the skeletal muscles, and the skeletal muscle will contract. So there are some examples of chemicals that act by inhibiting the breakdown of acetylcholine. So we'll put ACH, which is how it's abbreviated, so that's acetylcholine, is normally broken down by an enzyme. So it doesn't stay in the synapse and cause long-term muscle contraction normally. But some chemicals can actually inhibit that breakdown. So they can actually inhibit the enzyme. And these include the nerve gas serin and the pesticide malthion. So sarin was the nerve gas that they were storing out of the chemical, Medulla chemical depot, and that they subsequently incinerated, right? So we don't have the nerve gas sarin, but sarin, what these do is that they inhibit the enzyme. So it would cause long-term contractions of skeletal muscle. But it also actually would also affect the respiratory system and your heart. So it also slows down the heart and the respiratory system, which would eventually lead to death. So this would lead to death, but it would also cause sustained muscle contraction. So we developed a chemical weapon that directly interacted with the levels of neurotransmitters in our synapses. And then we also produced a pesticide, so this could be used to kill, for example, it could be used inside to kill fleas, right? So you have to be very careful when you use this pesticide, specifically because it can interact with your nervous system, just like it interacts with the nervous system of the insect or the arthropod that it's designed to destroy. Okay. So if you've taken psychology, you probably have heard about dopamine, because this is our feel-good neurotransmitter. So it specifically affects mood. And so dopamine levels can be influenced by what we eat, for example. So it's been shown that things like fatty foods, like maybe French fries, actually affect the levels of dopamine in our brain, so that when we eat them, they actually make us feel good. So those fatty foods tend to be the types of foods we go to when we want comfort, right? So we tend to eat. So what we eat can actually affect dopamine levels. But we've also been able to create some drugs that also influence the levels of dopamine in our body. And specifically, cocaine prevents the reuptake of dopamine from the synapse. There's another drug that also influences dopamine levels, and this would be methamphetamines. So methamphetamines cause excessive release of dopamine into the synapse. So it's a slightly different mechanism. But what these two things are going to do is that they're going to cause your brain to have too much dopamine. So you might initially experience a rush when taking these drugs because there are more action potentials being generated in the brain. The problem, however, comes from your nervous system is going to want to make sure that there is less dopamine. So the nervous system, in response to changing your levels of dopamine, is going to respond by decreasing the production. So the nervous system decreases the production of the neurotransmitter. So this responds by decreasing production. Because obviously there is an optimal level of dopamine in your brain. Too much can actually make it so that you can't function normally, right? And so then you start to get withdrawals. So withdrawal happens when the levels of neurotransmitters are too low. Okay, and so then it also maybe takes more cocaine to give you the high, because a little bit of cocaine might just bring you back up to what you normally would be feeling, right? But then more cocaine would actually make you feel the high. So that actually also means that you have to take more of the drug to get the same effect. So methamphetamines affect the dopamine producing neurons, and they can sometimes actually lead to nerve cell death. So one of the reasons why methamphetamine is such a bad drug is this can lead to nerve cell death. Unlike cocaine, which generally isn't associated with permanent brain damage, methamphetamines can sometimes be associated with shaking, right? And so they actually destroy, or actually causes the destruction of cells in your brain that cause symptoms very similar to Parkinson's disease. And so the shaking, even when a person is not taking methamphetamines, even if they're recovered from addiction, that shaking can be permanent because they've actually damaged the part of their brain that regulates motor movements. And so they essentially have a chemically induced form of Parkinson's disease. Now, methamphetamines actually also influence the level of what other neurotransmitter? Does anybody know? What other neurotransmitter? What's the amphetamine part? What does amphetamine make you feel like? Speed, right? So it causes everything to speed up, your heart, your breathing, your activity levels, right? So methamphetamines were initially taken because they could keep people awake all night long so they could work, right? So it's like truck drivers who wanted to drive all night long would take methamphetamines to speed everything up and keep them alert and awake. And so this also causes excessive levels of adrenaline. So this is, the name for adrenaline is actually norepinephrine, right? And norepinephrine is released by your adrenal glands, and it is your fight or flight hormone. So it essentially puts people who are on amphetamines into fight or flight, which kind of makes them a little bit crazy to deal with, because they're all jacked up on the norepinephrine. So another interesting neurotransmitter that we manipulate is serotonin. So serotonin is interesting because it's inhibitory in the brain, but it stimulates skeletal muscle. So you can be prescribed drugs that influence your serotonin levels in your brain. For example, if you have anxiety, but also if you have depression. And so what is this group of drugs referred to as? Yes. So this is, we'll just put SRI, so we'll get rid of the selective. So SRI, right? So this is a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So Prozac is an SRI. So is things like Celexa, or I think Zoloft is another example of one that just is the drug name, right? And so what these do is they inhibit the brain, but they also stimulate your skeletal muscles. So if somebody is depressed, it looks like they're sitting there doing nothing, but really they could be having anxiety, and that's why they're doing nothing. So to like get up and do something is just anxiety induced. So if you can inhibit their anxious thoughts, but then also make them want to get up and move, then you're going to influence their overall behavior. So they can go to work and they can go to school and they can act relatively normal because they have more serotonin in their synapses. Serotonin is also interesting because 90% of the serotonin in your body is actually associated with your digestive tract. And so there is new evidence that suggests that the microbiome in your digestive system can actually influence your serotonin levels, so your diets can play a big role in your mood and behavior. And just like the cocaine or the methamphetamines, going off of SRIs can be really tricky because you can have withdrawals. So you can't just take SRIs and then decide one day, well, this is just a prescription drug, right? I'm just gonna stop taking it. Because if you stop taking it cold turkey, you're gonna get withdrawal symptoms. So it also causes withdrawal. And you would predict that your body, in response to SRIs, is actually going to stop producing so much serotonin. So why are low levels of serotonin kind of important? They're important because if we are, we need to be, if this is too high, right? We have too much serotonin in our brain, we're not going to be as reactive, right? So we want to be a little bit reactive to bad circumstances. So if you're like all high on serotonin, you're really chill, right? You might not react negatively to bad situations, which evolutionarily is a bad thing. The other thing that this does is if you have too much serotonin in your system, it's going to decrease your sexual desires. So you're going to be less interested because you're not being stimulated that way, and you're going to have a much harder time coming to orgasm, for example, if your serotonin levels are too high. So there is this controversy over whether or not we should be drugging ourselves to keep our serotonin levels high, because what we're essentially is just numbing ourselves, right? Against maybe a culture that it would be better that the culture changed rather than changing our own brain biology. And it's really a big deal because now they're starting to give the SRIs to children, and then they don't really understand how that might affect their brain development. Right? So if you're on SRIs as a child, how is that going to affect how your brain functions as an adult? Okay, so probably the most famous one in terms of withdrawals is what drug? What drug do you always talk about when people are withdrawing? Heroin, right? Okay, so heroin actually mimics a naturally occurring neurotransmitter. So it mimics endorphins. And endorphins is actually short for endogenous morphine. So what that means is that we have endogenous pain relief that we produce in response to painful circumstances. This could be exercise, right? So when you exercise, sometimes you're actually damaging your tissues. You might be damaging your connective tissue in your joints. You might actually be tearing your muscles, and by tearing the muscles, you're going to actually make your muscles bigger, right? And so the runner's high is actually related to the release of endogenous morphine. So why exercising makes you high is because it releases this. If you've ever been under extreme pain, childbirth would be an example. If you don't take a painkiller that numbs everything from your waist down, then you'd be producing a lot of endogenous morphine, which is natural pain relief. And so you get high off of that as well. So this is important because under circumstances of pain, we want to be able to perceive pain, but we don't want excessive amounts of pain, right? So what this does is this actually, heroin actually binds to the same receptors. Okay, so it binds to the same receptors and it inhibits pain. Right? So withdrawals are excessively painful due to the low levels of endorphins, because your body has stopped producing endorphins because it senses it's too high. So this is due to the low levels of endorphins. Right? So it can be extremely painful. And as such, most people have a hard time withdrawing. And so they tend to like to wean people off of heroin. And so there's two ways that you can do this. You could give them maintenance doses of heroin. And this is using clean needles, right? So if you went to a clinic, you would get a clean needle rather than using needles that somebody else used, because that would decrease your likelihood of getting HIV, and it would also decrease your likelihood of getting hepatitis. And those are two things that are costly as a society. And so if the government provides maintenance doses of heroin like they do in Europe, right? That's because they're trying to limit HIV and hepatitis infections. So this maintenance dose means that it just gets the people back up to where we all are, right? And so it doesn't give them any excessive pain or high, because it just kind of brings everybody up to where we are. And then if you keep lowering it, then hopefully the body will return to homeostatic balance, right? So as you decrease the levels of heroin, your body will increase the levels of endorphins that are produced. So we generally do not use this maintenance dose of heroin. What do we use? And wasn't there just a clinic that just opened up in Pendleton? What do we use instead of heroin? What is the chemical? Anybody know? It's methadone. Okay, so this is either a pill or liquid. Yes. And so people say, well, why give them methadone instead of just giving them heroin? Or why give them either one of those? The problem is that if they are in so much pain that they're going to go out and steal, they're going to go out and commit crimes because they're in so much pain from the withdrawals, then you have to give them something so as a society we can continue to function, right? And so the pill or liquid is methadone is addictive, just like heroin, but you're not injecting it using dirty needles. And so you're not going to increase the number of people in your population that have HIV and hepatitis by injecting it. So that's why they give a pill or liquid. So these people have to go to the clinic like every day, right? They go in, they get their maintenance dose, just brings it back up to where everybody else is, and then they go off to work. And then over time, they try to slowly wean people off. And this is similar, heroin, is similar to the opiates that we are being prescribed, like oxycodone. So oxycodone acts the same way.
Is that one like worse than other painkillers?
There is one that they just came out with. It's not oxycodone. It is, what's the really bad? They made a new one that's actually fentanyl. Yeah, fentanyl patches. Those are actually more dangerous because you can much more easily overdose on them and die.
So like when I had surgery, I can't take any painkillers. I'm not easily sick. So the only one they had was oxycodone, but they didn't.
This is extremely addictive, especially to some people. And so if you know that you have an addiction to this is kind of a bad thing, because then when you go in and have surgery, literally they don't want to give it to you, right? And that's kind of a bad thing, because sometimes surgery is really painful, and afterwards it can be really painful. Yeah. allergic to, so you can't take it. It causes an allergic response.
It makes us sick.
Yeah, yeah. It actually upsets everybody's stomach. Yeah, but an allergic reaction would mean like maybe cause swelling in your throat or made you really sick. Yeah. Okay. So those would be examples of some neurotransmitters and how they act normally, and then the drugs that interact and affect the levels of neurotransmitters in the body. Okay, so we're going to go over the nervous system just briefly. You probably have learned a lot about the nervous system if you've taken a psychology class. But in the central nervous system consists of two parts. What are the two parts of our central nervous system? Does anybody know? That's actually autonomic. So that's actually peripheral. So that's actually going out to the organs and affecting the heart and the lungs and the digestive system. So the central nervous system is your brain, right? And your spinal cord. Okay. Your brain has only one part of it that is conscious, and that is what is referred to as the cerebral cortex. So this is the only conscious, meaning that we can consciously perceive, part of the brain. So that is the outer part, and in mammals, it has convolutions. And so the mammalian brain has ridges and grooves that kind of look like this, right? So the mammalian brain has ridges and grooves. So there's some controversy over whether or not we can say that humans are the only conscious animals on the planet. Conscious meaning that I can distinguish myself from others, right? So I can kind of, and I can remember things, and I guess I don't know, I quite understand how to define consciousness. I should look that up. But anyway, I can detect myself as being separate from others, and I can remember and act in a way that is self-serving. So there's actually quite a bit of evidence that other animals are also conscious. And specifically, it's kind of interesting that the dolphin's brain actually has a cerebral cortex that is larger than our own relative to their body size. And so dolphins actually have a larger part of their brain that is the conscious part of their brain. They actually think that that might be because they have to use sonar. So they send out a sound, and then that sound, the sound waves bounce off of potential prey, for example, and then they come back and it actually is perceived as an image to them. So they use sonar to find their prey, for example. And so maybe that's why they have a larger cerebral cortex than we do, but I'm not sure. So the cerebral cortex has different parts. So it has different areas. So we're still on the brain, sorry. Different areas associated with different sensations. Okay. So for example, we have an olfactory cortex. What do you think that is responsible for? Smell. We have a gustatory cortex. What do you think about that? Anybody know? Taste. Okay. We have a visual cortex, And this visual cortex, for example, is in the back of our head, which is why sometimes when people get damage, brain damage in the back of the head, they lose their sight, right? So this is vision. Auditory, right? This is hearing. And then we have another cortex, which are part of the cortex, which is called the Somato Sensory. So think somato means body, sensory. So this is things like touch. Yes. Pain. It also, and you don't need to know this, but it also is associated with our joints and our muscles. So my somatosensory cortex is what tells me that my arm is bent rather than my arm being straight. And so that's what is referred to as proprioception, but that goes to the somatosensory cortex. There's another part that it coordinates movement. So the motor cortex, this coordinates conscious movement. So if I want to move my finger, there's a part of the cortex where the action potential is generated there. So something generates that action potential and then it gets sent out and it goes through my brain, down through my spinal cord, and then out through nerves that innervate the muscle, releasing acetylcholine and causing the muscles to contract. And so the motor cortex is involved in specifically the movement of skeletal muscle rather than other types of muscle like heart or smooth. So this is skeletal muscle. So if we look at a diagram of this, oops, that's my spinal cord. Okay. So this is a cross-section through the brain, actually not a cross-section, it would be a longitudinal section through the brain, mid-sagittal section. So here you can see that the hemisphere is the largest part of the brain, and we have a right and a left hemisphere. The right one is believed to be more artistic, and the left one more logic. And then if you look at this very outer part, this is not that deep. So the cortex is only about maybe 1/4 of an inch in depth. And so it's the outer part of the brain, that cerebral cortex, that is responsible for conscious sensations, perception of your senses, and also conscious movement. So if a person becomes brain dead, then there is no electrical activity in the cortex. So brain dead means there's no electrical activity in the cerebral cortex. So they can put electrodes on your brain and they can measure that electrical activity. Those are called brain waves. And the brain waves change depending upon whether you're awake, whether you're thinking, like problem solving, or whether you're asleep. But if you have no electrical activity in the cerebral cortex, then you're considered essentially dead, even though you can still blink, you can still breathe, you can still swallow. But for some reason, there's no way to reboot, to restart the cerebral cortex once it has lost its electrical activity. So all this other part of the brain would be the unconscious activity. So for example, we did talk about the medulla oblongata, and what does it do? Does anybody know? What did we talk about it in reference to? We talked about respiration, and we talked about blood pH, and the medulla oblongata helps to regulate our respiration so that we get rid of CO2 and maintain our blood pH, right? Now, if we look at the spinal cord, The spinal cord is not conscious, but it is it's kind of a relay station. So sensory information coming up from my toes comes up through my nerves and into my spinal cord, and then from out, motor coordination moves out through the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is protected by the vertebrae. Between the vertebrae are intervertebral discs. So they actually act to cushion the vertebrae, which is actually a really kind of a bad design. If we were still on all fours, then we wouldn't have so much pressure exerted on the intervertebral discs. But once we've stood up, then there's a lot of pressure. And so what tends to happen as we age is we get herniation of the disc. So disc herniations can push on the spinal cord or on spinal nerves. So, for example, I had a herniation in my neck, which caused a lot of pain down my arms. And kind of every time I walked, it would actually kind of cause an electrical shock to move out through my arms. So this was very dangerous because if it is in the neck region, then if it does damage to your spinal cord, it can actually cause you to become paralyzed. So you hear about people that they are sitting in their lawn chair and they fall over and they break their neck and then they're paralyzed, right? They're quadriplegics. And it might have been that they had a little bit of a herniation, but then when they fell, that caused a massive herniation that then damaged the spinal cord or severed the spinal cord, and then they become paralyzed. And so herniations in the neck region are much more dangerous. So what they tend to do, this is actually in the neck region. And the reason I can tell is because this is characteristic of the neck. And actually it says right here, C6, C7. So that's the up in the neck region. And so this is actually pushing on the spinal cord. And once the spinal cord has become damaged, then the spinal cord does not regenerate very well at all. The brain can regenerate itself, but the spinal cord doesn't seem to do the same kind of thing. So that regeneration doesn't work very well. And so then that can lead to paralysis. And so what they generally do is they go in through your neck and they come in and they remove the herniation. They might actually remove the whole disc. And then they put a piece of cadaver bone where the disc would be, and then a titanium plate in, and they kind of fuse. So they fuse the two vertebrae together. So that's actually not the most common herniation. The most common herniation is L5S1. So this is my most common, or this is the most common herniation that people have. So this is between the lumbar, which is the last vertebrae that you have, and the sacrum, which is actually composed of 5 fused vertebrae. So this is the low back problem that people get when they get what is referred to as sciatic pain, right? So this can cause sciatic pain by pressing on the spinal nerve. This can make it so it's painful to stand, it's painful to sit, it's painful to walk, right? This is the pain that goes down your back of your leg, right? And this can actually cause a weakening of the muscles in that side of your body. and then it becomes harder and harder to walk. And so you see some people, they walk around and they're kind of lifting their leg like this, right? That is actually oftentimes due to a herniation here. Now, the thing about this L5-S1 is that the spinal cord does not reach down that far. So the spinal cord does not extend down this far. Okay. So it's less dangerous to have L5-S1 because this is not going to paralyze you. It's not going to turn you into a quadriplegic. It's not going to paralyze your diaphragm so that you die because you can't breathe, right? It's simply just pressing on the nerves that are coming out of the spinal cord. So actually, there's been a lot of recent study about this, and it appears that there's a lot of people walking around with disc herniations that have no symptoms. And so if you go in and you have sciatic pain, they oftentimes want you to go to a physical therapist to see if you can treat it that way before actually getting an MRI to see if you have a disc herniation, because it could be that you can actually treat this without having to do surgery. So the MRI is like what you do, and then as soon as you get the MRI results and they see the herniation, they're going to want to do surgery. So they try to get you to do physical therapy. Any questions about that idea? About disc herniation in the spinal cord?
Can you be born with that?
No. So there are some spinal cord disorders where you're born, and this is one example is Spina Bifida. So Spina Bifida is where the vertebrae are not enclosing the whole spinal cord. So Spina Bifida is a birth defect. And actually, cats that are born with no tail actually have a very, I don't remember what that's called, but they actually have a very mild form of Spina Bifida because they have a reduced set of vertebrae, right? Because they have no tail. And so what happens here is that babies are born with a sac extending out of their spinal column. And that has nervous tissue in it. It actually has the meninges, the covering, and it has cerebral spinal fluid in it. And so that can be a very devastating disease that can lead to paralysis, hard to treat it. The exciting thing about Spina Bifida is that they have discovered that it is a lack of a prenatal vitamin. Does anybody know what vitamin must you take prenatally? So if you're pregnant, if a female is pregnant, what does she need to have in her diet to prevent Spina Bifida?
Is it iron?
Not iron. It's a B vitamin. It is folic acid. So folic acid is a necessary nutrient. And so they recommend that even if you're thinking about becoming pregnant, but not even sure when you're going to become pregnant, that's why the doctors prescribe prenatal vitamins. Because if you find out you're pregnant at 8 weeks, it might be too late for the nervous system starts to develop really early on. So you want to have lots of folic acid online before you get pregnant, so that will help to prevent Spina Bifida. Okay, so that was the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system consists of nerves. So like the sciatic nerve, that is actually something that comes out of the spinal cord and travels to the periphery of your body, right? So that's why it's called the peripheral nervous system. So nerves are bundles of axons. So you remember that my neuron, if I just draw it, you don't need to draw this neuron, but remember that my neuron has a cell body and it has these dendrites and then it has these long axons. The cell bodies actually reside in the central nervous system. So the cell bodies, like for example, motor neurons, so if this is the motor neuron that's going out to my skeletal muscle, this is my spinal cord. Right? This would be my leg muscle. Right? So the crazy thing about our neurons is that they're super long, right? Because my cell bodies of all my neurons extending out into my legs the cell bodies are actually in my spinal cord. And then we have these cytoplasmic extensions that get bundled together that leave the spinal cord and then go out to the bodies. And so these are very long cytoplasmic extensions, right? And they are bundled into an organ. So the nerves are not just nervous tissue. They have surrounding them connective tissue. They have blood vessels. Blood vessels deliver nutrients and oxygen to your nerves, right? So nerves are not actually just tissue, they're actually an organ. So your sciatic nerve would be an organ. Your ulnar nerve, like when you hit your elbow, that is what travels here. And that would be also an organ. So the ulnar nerve is your funny bone nerve that when you hit it, it causes tingling and pain. So we have two parts to the somatic nervous system, or to the peripheral nervous system, the somatic nervous system. And then I'm going to put a little here, I'm going to put autonomic, and I'm going to write underneath these. Okay. So the somatic innervates, which means it makes synapses with skeletal muscle. The autonomic innervates cardiac muscle, glands, and smooth muscle. Okay. So the signal that causes yourself to start salivating, the signal that causes you to start to sweat, the signal that causes your pancreas to release insulin, for example, would all be the autonomic nervous system. The changing of your respiratory rates, you're breathing harder after you exercise, the shunting of blood to your skin, and the increase in heart rate and blood pressure are all autonomic functions, okay? So this is, somatic is conscious, or it tends to be conscious, right? Conscious movement. This tends to be unconscious, although, through biofeedback, you can slow your heart rate down, right? You could also do it just by breathing deeply. Okay, so the autonomic has two divisions. We have the sympathetic and we have the parasympathetic. So the sympathetic is your fight or flight. This one is your relaxation and digestion. So they work in coordination to maintain homeostasis. Question?
Does that go under the autonomic?
Yes. So we're now talking about the divisions of the autonomic. Thank you. So the true neurotransmitters that are involved, sympathetic is norepinephrine. okay? This tends to be longer acting than acetylcholine, which is shorter acting. So I'll just put longer acting versus acetylcholine, which is shorter acting. Acetylcholine tends to be degraded and broken down because there's an enzyme that breaks it down really rapidly. So sympathetic would increase heart rate, increase breathing. It would shunt blood to the muscles. It also causes sweating and the release of glucose. So your glucose levels actually go high when you're in fight or flight. So this has exactly the opposite. So it has an opposite effect, but it also increases digestion. So blood gets shunted to your digestive system and away from your muscles. So one of the interesting things is looking at how these work in opposition. So for example, if you are at home and you've just eaten dinner and you're laying on the couch, you'll notice that your blood, or you maybe feel the blood is going to your digestive system. Your digestive system is working really hard. Your heart rate is decreased, your breathing rate is decreased, you're about ready to fall asleep, right? And then somebody storms in through the front door, right? You want that short acting, right? You want to be able to override this, you're being drowsy on the couch. So you jump up, right? And then it's just like your friend who has some exciting news. And you're like, man, I was almost asleep. Now my stomach hurts, right? My heart rate is going to take me forever to get back asleep, and you're angry because norepinephrine is long acting. So it's really hard to come back down after the fight or flight, to come back down to this relaxation. Now, there is evidence that in today's world, we're kind of always in, or we tend to be much more in fight or flight than our ancestors would have been in. So every time your phone dings, do you get like a little, what is it, right? Little response, fight or flight response, right? And so constantly freaking out, I call it constant freak out syndrome, where like every time of the day you have these little constant freakouts, like, where are my keys? Oh, I've lost my keys. Where's my purse? Oh, I've lost my purse. And you get all like worked up about it. That can actually lead to bad things. One thing that it can lead to is it can lead to what's called metabolic syndrome, where you start to be stressed out and you release cortisol and you start to gain weight, right? So you could actually become insulin resistant from constant chronic stress, right? It's just not good for your body. So what you need to do is you need to figure out how to reduce the number of episodes where you feel that fight or flight surge. And that is hard because some people kind of get addicted to feeling fight or flight all the time. Right? People that are kind of like that, they're like, oh, it's like, chill, would you just relax? They're always like, right? And so this is actually better for you. You want to kind of be in this, you want to be in parasympathetic. In yoga, that's what they try to promote, is even when you're exercising, you're not stimulating fight or flight. So when you're exercising, you're stimulating fight or flight, you're actually counteracting all the good effects that exercise has on your body by being in fight or flight. So even when you're exercising, you want to try to be in relaxed mental state. So that's the peripheral nervous system divided. And then on Monday, we're going to talk about the sensory, and then we're going to talk about reproduction, and then that's the end of the quarter. So make sure that you study for your quiz on Monday. So I'll stop there, and we're going to talk about sensory systems and reproduction next week.